this video lecture is going to talk about one type of confound, which is called the common cause confounds. So remember in a previous video lecture we talked about what confounds are, that those are variables that change the relationship between x and y, and that we want to control for them if we want to demonstrate causality. So here we're going to talk about two different types of confounds. This first one, in this first video lecture, we're going to talk about something called the common cause confound. And the next video lecture that's going to follow right after this is going to look at the correlated cause confound. So what I want to do in these two video lectures is to map out what confounds look like in practice, how they work, so you can get better at recognizing them. So what's a common cause confound? This is when x and y are correlated, and that's because they both share some common cause, z. All right, so z is causing both x and it's causing y. And so we diagram it like this. So we see here, here's our x, and here's our y. Normally, if this was a causal relationship, what we do is that we'd have an arrow going between these, right? But we see here instead is that there's a curved arrow that has arrowheads on either side. And what this here shows is that there's correlation. It shows that there's correlation instead of a causal relationship. Go down here, we have z down here, and z is doing its work. Z causes x, and z also causes y. And so what the story is here is that x and y, they're correlated. You might initially think that they're causally related, but it's just because they both share this the common cause confound of z. Okay, so let's talk through an example to see what this means. So you might imagine that you have a question about whether listening to classical music, if that increases somebody's IQ scores, right? And so you see that listening to classical music is correlated with IQ scores. And you might even have some sort of explanation for that listening classical music calms you and helps you pay attention when you're studying more, and that overall improves your level of intelligence over time. Okay, so it's a plausible relationship, but is it really a causal one? So here, what we can see is that there's this correlation, and you might ask if there's some other confound, namely, the thing immediately that I would think of is the confound of income. So people who have higher incomes are more likely to listen to classical music, and that's because higher income just ends up going along with that. There's nothing inherent about making more money that makes you more likely to listen to classical music, but because of different social circumstances, because of different friendship networks, things like that, you might be more likely to listen to classical music because of your income. And you might also have more disposable income to go to things like orchestras. And having higher income has had this causal effect on IQ scores, not necessarily on intelligence, but definitely on IQ scores. That one of the criticisms of IQ is that it's actually measuring a family's income more than it's measuring a base rate of intelligence. And so what you could see here is that there might be this relationship, but it's actually caused by the prior cause of income for both of these, the x and the y. Let's go through another example. So you might have a hypothesis that greater media coverage, and that's your x, would cause a candidate to get a higher share of the vote in a political primary. And so imagine that you have a friend who is a big Tulsi Gabbard fan, right? And they're complaining that Tulsi Gabbard in the 2020 primary really got the short end of the stick. And that she never got a fair chance because the media largely ignored her candidacy. And so as a result, the media was unable to cover her, the media refused to cover her, and because of that media coverage, she didn't do well in the primaries. All right, so here, x and y, we see, we can map this out as media coverage is x, and vote share in the primary is y, right? And so we see a correlation that candidates that have less media coverage don't do as well in the primary. Question again is whether it's causal. So an alternative confound that you might want to take into consideration is their success in raising funds. It could be that candidates that are more successful in fundraising gain a lot more media coverage. The major networks might take that candidate a lot more seriously, and there probably are also stories about their successes in fundraising. If somebody's not raising money, the news networks are not going to really consider that person to be a viable candidate. And then likewise, if a candidate is unable to raise funds, they're unable to make the kinds of investments that would be needed to do well in the primary, right? And so that would also cause a lower share of the vote in the primary. And so if I were to be looking at the relationship between media coverage and vote share in the primary, I want to make sure that I'm controlling for fundraising levels and seeing whether the media coverage itself is what shaped people's vote choice.